There's been some controversy lately about Daniel 9:27 and who the he is. I'm of the position that this is definitely talking about the Antichrist, versus other people would suggest that it could be Jesus Christ or Titus from 70 AD. And all sides are basically looking at a context slash history slash description of the passage for understanding. But I really do believe that if you're going to say it's Jesus or Titus, you're not going to be able to read the text as it just plainly reads. So in verse 26 of Daniel 9, it mentions the prince that shall come, and he's, of course, having an army of the people of the prince that shall come. So he's in charge of the people of the prince that shall come because it's his people. And that's a lowercase prince as opposed to a capital prince, capital P for prince, where, for example, in Daniel 9:25 it says, unto the Messiah the prince, that's capitalized. So this is something that's in the text, and if you accept the authority of the pure Cambridge edition of the King James Bible, and I'm pretty sure just about any modern King James Bible that you pick up today is going to read like this, you're going to see the obvious distinguishment. Messiah, for example, is mentioned twice in Daniel 9 with a capital M in verse 25 and verse 26. It's a capital M for Messiah. So two verses back to back, it's capitalized, but yet Prince is only capitalized once in verse 25, and then in verse 26, it's a lowercase prince. And obviously, that shows you that the editors believe that these are two different princes that were being talked about. And that's just simply irrefutable if you hold to a position like I do that the pure Cambridge edition of the King James Bible is accurate, and it's the perfect presentation of the text. But beyond that, there's even just the description, and honestly, that's how the editors, for example, would have come up to this. But I do believe the fact that they recognize the description also is kind of an advanced revelation of understanding that the prince is different from Messiah the Prince. Like, that's an additional revelation you get being a pure Cambridge edition Bible believer. But furthermore, just in Daniel 9:27, and he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. Plain reading of this is simply that somebody confirms the covenant with many. I would say this is the Jews that we're dealing with. There could be an expansion on that, but I would just say because it follows it right up with, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. Well, who has sacrifices going on? Jews. Okay? That's who does sacrifices here. We're not talking about another group. We're talking about Jews that have daily sacrifices going on. And then in the midst of the week, those sacrifices cease. It's just the plain reading of how that works. Now, some might want to just argue about, well, and in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, as if he does an event that causes the sacrifice and the oblation to cease later. Sorry, but that's just, again, if that's the true meaning of the text, it's a secondary understanding of just how it reads on the surface. The plain understanding is that in the midst of the week, in the midst of which is a 7-year period, in the midst of that 7-year period, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations, he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. So again, I just submit to you that it's very simple. There's somebody that makes the covenant with many for 1 week. So that's a 7-year covenant. And in the midst of the week of that covenant, the daily sacrifice ceases. And then it's obviously replaced with the abomination of desolation. Okay? If we can if we're allowed to compare the other languages in Daniel, again, it's the abomination that maketh desolate. It's the transgression of desolation. These are all talking about the same event. It's beautiful, it's consistent, and it allows you to understand Daniel on his own terms, as opposed to just saying, well, Daniel 8's one thing, Daniel 9's one thing, Daniel 11's one thing, Daniel 12's one thing. No, all talking about the same event. And also, I would just point out that when it says he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, some people want to say that, well, if he's confirming the covenant for 7 years, therefore he's not breaking it. But I would just submit to you that confirm, for how it's being used here, does not mean confirm as in I'm keeping my word for 7 years. It's confirm as in more like signing an agreement. That would be confirming the covenant for 1 week. That's what I would say is going on here. And when you look, if you look up enough sort of terminology in Webster's 1828 dictionary, you look up confirm, and I want to say ratify, and just follow a couple different terms sort of as they come up in the definitions, and just kind of keep searching Webster's for those terms. You'll kind of keep seeing that, hey, this is an act of recognition by an authority about the validity of something. So again, there's a covenant that exists, and again, that's, I would say, because there's a proposal of terms. That's the covenant, but then there's actually a point at which that covenant is confirmed, meaning it's in force. Okay? I do not believe that this is talking about keeping your word to the terms of the agreement for 7 years. No, I believe this is talking about basically, like, for example, signing something into law. But whether or not, for example, police officers or other agents of authority who have to execute that law, it's a different story as to whether or not, they will uphold that law. Hope you get the point on that. And then I think a lot of people would recognize that, for example, the Old Covenant, which was for the Israelites, was confirmed by basically the blood of animals. Okay, being sprinkled upon the people in the book and the things of God. That was the confirmation of the covenant. And if you look at what the Old Testament says of itself, you're going to see reference to it being an everlasting covenant, like for the Levites and their service and ministry. But yet, what do we know from the New Testament? We know that it's disannulled because there's a New Testament, there's a new covenant. As far as covenant and testament, I don't believe they're exactly the same thing, but I believe they're just very closely related in how the Bible uses the terms. Testament more has to do with, like, for example, your will and testament, things related to after you die, versus covenant, it can be all your life. But nevertheless, I think sometimes the Bible nearly interchangeably uses that terminology. But there is a difference. But anyway, all that to basically say that that covenant from the Old Testament that heavily centered upon what the service of the Levite priests would do, that was set up as an everlasting covenant, and yet it got disannulled. So it was put away. We don't do those things anymore because we have a better sacrifice. So what do you do about that? Do you say, well, that everlasting covenant, do you just say that was never confirmed? Or do you say, well, actually it was confirmed, by basically that sprinkling of the blood upon the book, the people, and I think some of the vessels of the ministry and whatnot, by Moses with earthly animals. That was the confirmation of the covenant, and that's a moment in time, as opposed to taking the terms of the Old Covenant, which is basically keep all of God's commandments and perform them. And Hebrews even tells you that which my covenant they break. Okay, so the Old Testament covenant obviously was broken. All right, and hence isn't confirmed. If you're going to say that confirmed means, well, it has to be lived up to the terms of the agreement. Well, it wasn't, because the covenant again is a agreement between two parties, it's between God and Israel. Israel didn't keep the covenant like pretty much ever overall. Um, and guess what? God regarded them not because of that. The covenant was violated, and now we have a new covenant that's far better, far simpler. Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and thou shalt be saved is the gist of it. Again, there's other specific things that relate to Israel, but that's just sort of the broad terms we can say. So the point is, when it says, "And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week," this is referring to an act of ratification. This is like a signing of an agreement. This is a promise of, I will uphold, whatever we've agreed to. And I think that would be, I think it could actually have quite a number of things going on to it, but I would say it's centered upon the daily sacrifices occurring. And then I think that the proof of that is just that in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate. And then from what I understand, when it says shall make it desolate, that's referring to the sanctuary from verse 26. Again, there could be broader implications too about just Jerusalem as a city, of course, but specifically centered upon the sanctuary. He shall make it desolate even till the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. So, yeah, I think it's critical just to recognize that the plain reading of this about confirming the covenant made for 1 week is that this is a confirmation of a covenant that's for 7 years. And that in the midst of that 7 years, the sacrifice and the oblation cease, because now the overspreading of abominations is going to happen. So, and then again, I think that's totally the plain understanding of it. But furthermore, if you still wanted to argue about the whole confirm the covenant means keeping your word for 7 years, well, okay, well, I guess in the midst of the week, the sacrifices and oblations are actually going to cease in the middle of the week. And the abomination of desolation is basically going to be set up, and that was all agreed upon from the start. So, again, I obviously that's not what I'm trying to say that you should believe that, but I'm just saying, like, in a quote-unquote backup scenario that I don't think is necessary to go to, well, I guess those are the terms of the agreement. But I certainly don't think that's what's happening. I think it's clear that it's about sacrifices and oblations to occur for a 7-year period of time for 1 week. In general, I would say from Daniel 8 that because it's 2,300 days, which is over 6 years of that vision of the daily sacrifice and transgression of desolation. So I would say that because that's short of 7 years, that it takes us all the way to the end of the years, that the daily sacrifices start within the week because they've been agreed upon to start, and that suggests that the temple, sanctuary, city aren't quite ready yet because that's sort of in construction phase still. Maybe it's already started pre to that, but it just hasn't been finished for that, or heck, for some reason they're just agreed to start it at a certain point within the week. But anyway, the point is that this covenant is going to involve daily sacrifices. That's going to cease in the middle of the week and going to be replaced with something abominable. And I think that's clear evidence of the word being broken there. Okay, just as much as the old covenant was broken, it was replaced. So too, in a sense, is this happening because you had a covenant for basically, I'd say, 7 years of daily sacrifices, and then that only ends up being for up to 3.5 years. I would say, based on Daniel 8, it'll be even a little bit less than 3.5 years, but you get the point. Again, breaking of the word for abomination and desolation in the latter 3.5. And I guess the other thing to point out is in Daniel 11, it actually does have reference to this. Now, of course, again, if you're somebody that just says Daniel 11, that's, that was before even Christ showed up on the scene. That was, I think that Antiochus Epiphanes or something is the Greek ruler who performed such an abomination of desolation. Now, I would certainly agree that in type, that's a type of the abomination of desolation, but Daniel 11 is, in general, as a whole, is speaking about future events, and it's actually speaking about the Antichrist interacting with kings and making war with them, and his political / religious motivations, and a revealing of that type of content. So really, Daniel 11 is just a ton of information about the Antichrist. He's the vile person, I think, from verse 21, I want to say. To verse 21. And in his estate shall stand up a vile person. Yeah, that'd be the Antichrist. And he's probably even mentioned even earlier in chapter 11 too, maybe as early as verse 2, about the fourth king. But anyway, here in Daniel 11, there actually is reference to this. So I want to say verse 22, and with the arms of a flood, which is an army, shall they be shall they be overflown from before him, and shall be broken. Yea, also the prince of the covenant. Well, that's interesting. So that's within the same context. You have broken and covenant. Okay, and after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully, for he shall come up and shall become strong with a small people. Again, this is the armies of the Antichrist defeating another king, the prince of the covenant. So it sounds like there is perhaps a prince of Israel who the Antichrist is going to make a covenant with, that's going to involve these daily sacrifices. And it calls that, and after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully, for he shall come up and shall become strong with a small people. And there's even references in Daniel 11 about going to the pleasant land, and I think that would definitely be a reference to Jerusalem. And the glorious holy mountain in verse 45. Like the tabernacles of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. So, and the context again continues right into Daniel 12. There's no, even though we have a chapter division, there's not actually a contextual break per se. There is to an extent about the topic. It does switch a little bit, but it is overall still a continuation of Daniel 11, and that we can demonstrate that. But Daniel 11, Daniel 12 are critical to be seen as events together. And if you're somebody who's premillennial, you definitely should understand that Daniel 12 is yet to come. And yet it's referring back to things in Daniel chapter 11, and that shows you how the Antichrist is in view. Okay? So, again, in Daniel 11, there's reference to the prince of the covenant. And with the arms of a flood shall they be overflown from before him, and shall be broken, yea, also the prince of the covenant. Well, if the Antichrist makes a covenant with the prince of the covenant, and that's broken, because the prince of the covenant is going to be broken, meaning he's going to be killed. So, when would that happen? Well, the midpoint. All right? And it says, after the league made with him. That's restating what the covenant is. The league made with him. Shall he work deceitfully, or he shall work deceitfully. So that's, again, the fact that, again, when he makes that covenant, that league, all right, it's in his heart to work deceitfully from the onset, and even before then, you could say. He's totally intends to be deceitful about it. And it even mentions the Holy Covenant. Then shall he return into his land with great riches, and his heart shall be against the Holy Covenant, and he shall do exploits, and return to his own land. So, I guess the other thing I want to point out is it's called the Holy Covenant. And then earlier in Daniel 9, again, verse 27 called it the covenant. But there's reference even earlier in the passage to the covenant of Moses. And what does that involve? Daily sacrifices. So what I'm saying is that this covenant that's confirmed for 1 week, it is a Mosaic covenant that's modified, because it's one that's confirmed for 7 years, meaning it's an agreement for a 7-year period, and is involving the daily sacrifices of Moses. So it's not exactly the Old Testament covenant, because again, there's also the league that's made. So again, that's like an agreement between kings, basically, or princes. So it's a combination of political and religious things together for 1 week. So it's different from the Old Testament covenant. It's different from, or let me say it this way: the covenant of Moses. It's different from the covenant of the New Testament speaks of, that all believers are a part of. Being part of the seed of Abraham, for example. It's different from the covenant that was promised to Abraham too. It is a, again, covenant for 1 week. I think one objection I did see someone bring up was from Acts 2, where it talks about, "Men and brethren, what shall we do?" Then Peter said unto them, "Repent, and be baptized, every one of you, in the name of Jesus Christ, for the remission of sins." What's basically said there as well, because we know that when it talks about for the remission of sins, it's not talking about you get baptized to get the remission of sins. No, it's rather talking about you get baptized because of the remission of sins. Now, granted, obviously, I take that position that this is absolutely talking about because of the remission of sins, not to get remission of sins. Yes. But that being said, the reason that we should go with that interpretation is not because of the grammar, it's because of theology. Because grammatically, it would be perfectly reasonable to see that as getting baptized to get the remission of sins. That's absolutely a valid possibility, grammatically speaking. But it's theology that determines that it must not be talking about to get saved. It's talking about because you're saved. All right? And then for Daniel 9, the reason that it's talking about, well, again, I would say first and foremost, when you see the word "for," I really do think in general, you should just be thinking of, it depends on the context, but I would just submit to you that the easiest reading of Daniel 9 is that it's referring to a covenant confirmed for 1 week, meaning a covenant of 7 years. That's just the plainest reading. You could say, maybe that's just because of 1 week. A covenant's confirmed with many because of 1 week. I still think that's a little odd. I really do believe that when you're bringing together the words, "and he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week," that the obvious contextual meaning of that is a covenant is confirmed with many for 1 week, meaning a covenant confirmed for 7 years. All right? And again, like I was saying earlier, this is not a covenant that is upheld for 7 years, meaning a covenant that's lived out for 7 years faithfully. No, it's referring to an agreement made. Again, the covenant already is the agreement, but it's the ratification of an agreement. It's basically signing the papers that we will do these things for 1 week, for 7 years. And then in the midst of the week, sacrifices and oblations cease. Plain meaning of that is that they actually do cease in the middle of the week, and that their floor-spreading abominations he shall make it desolate, basically. So, yeah, this is talking about the Antichrist. Daniel 9:26 is as well. Again, you could find some things, in history that, Titus, for example, but no, it doesn't live up to the full description. So ultimately, this is primarily talking about the Antichrist. Daniel 9:26, 27, with the prince that shall come. This is, he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. Covenant for 7 years, breaks out in the middle of the 7 years, abomination of desolation. And then Daniel 11 talks about it being the league, talks about it being the holy covenant. So yeah, easiest reading of the text, and hope people can see that and just not fall for ideas that are trying to put this in the past when it's actually a future. Amen. Thank you.